guess we can start. We're given the customary 5 minutes that really make a gigantic difference in this day and age. I have to say, it's quite moving to see how punctual people can be, even in this day and age. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm Paola Antonelli. I'm a Curator of Architecture and Design here at MoMA and the Director of R&D of our great departments with a very big R and very small d. But as many of you already know, our R is as generous and altruistic as possible, also because we like to really work with you to figure out more how the museum can help people, not even audience, people like you, like me, and like everybody we live with, deal with the serious items and serious topics that happen to us in life. For those of you that have been here in the past months, we've dealt with topics such as the future, algorithms, death, truth. But I have to say, rarely have I had such a hard time as with silence. It's so interesting. I thought that it would be maybe not a walk in the park, but at least something that Erica Petrillo, who's the new R&D research assistant, by the way, let's give her a shout out. She's here for the next 12 months. We thought we could handle it pretty easily, and instead, we really found ourselves grappling with one of the biggest mysteries of human existence, even more mysterious, believe it or not, than death, because death is final and also is unknown. Silence instead is something that we live with, that we grapple with every day of our lives. Interestingly, I'm the daughter of an otolaryngology surgeon, ear, nose, throat, who is also an audiologist. So I grew up drawing cochleas for him and inner ears. I could draw one now in like ink. I was making all of his slides. And I prepared for this night also by talking with him. You know, even this morning I was on Skype with him and I was telling him, Dad, what's silence from a medical viewpoint? How can I visualize it? What can I show? And he was telling me about pure tonal audiometry and all the kind of systems and tests that one uses for deafness. But in the end, he told me, Paola, silence does not exist. Because even in the absence of any auditory stimulus, we still have proprioceptors. We still have haptic systems. We still have neural resting response, which is the kind of sound, the echo that even a nerve that is severed from the brain makes nonetheless, and that our body and our brain can perceive. So silence does not exist. But at the same time, it exists for those who experience it as a dimension of life. Are these people only the people that are deaf? No, not really. They're also the people that are oppressed by political systems or social systems that are ingrained or that are created anew. They are the people that kind of like mute themselves and that kind of go into a spiral of silence that is self-censorship. There are many, many different facets of science. There is also what my friend Maria distinguishes as quietude. So quiet and silence as the absence of bother and the absence of noise. But going back to my father, I remember driving with him for many, many, many hours sometimes to his conferences because he always had to drive. He didn't want to take trains. And I would be only alone with him. And sometimes we would go for really long stretches of road without speaking to each other. And I remember him telling me one day, you know, the people you can be in silence with are the ones you're really close to. How interesting, you know, how interesting to think also of the need that we have to fill silence out of embarrassment, out of discomfort with other fellow beings, and how instead with the people that we're really comfortable with, we don't need to do so. Why? Because we're not in silence anyway. There's an exchange of communication, of information, and even of affection that is present all the time. Well, tonight we're here to tackle this gigantic topic that is silence. We were saying before that silence does not exist, and I want to start this presentation again with the cosmos, the way we started it last year. I'm sorry, last year. It was, well, no, it wasn't last year. It was just a few months ago, but there's an exhibition that went through in the past months, so it feels like last year. Do I have a little bit of feedback or no? Am I just dreaming it? Okay, no problem then. But the last salon was about truth, and we had here also Jana Levin, who wrote about the book that speaks about the kind of the sound of the two black holes colliding. It's called Black Hole Blues. And I was thinking, as I was reading the definitions of science, there's the famous 1979 alien slogan, which is in space, nobody can hear you scream. Well, actually, people can hear you in space, scream or not. And definitely, we can hear space when things happen. You see here the two sound waves that were detected by the LIGO network of sensors here on Earth that detected the two black holes colliding. So silence is nonetheless a presence in our life. And lately, it's become also really a presence in our political consciousness. So tonight, we're going to talk about different types of silence, but not all of them. We're going to just scratch the surface as usual, and you're going to leave with more questions than you come in with, but also with a great reading list. And our speakers will help us think more in the future. So we're going to talk about silence as absence of auditory signals. Actually, we already have. We're not going to go that much into it again until we have our speakers contribute. Then we're going to talk about silence as powerlessness and exclusion, a very, very timely topic. I'm sure that this is on your mind every day in these past few months or year, actually. Silence as complicity, also that is very much part of our consciousness as citizens in this day and age. Silence as protest, and then, last but not least, silence as commodity. I'm going to actually start with silence as commodity. And I'm sure that many of you will disagree, but it's a big question mark that I found in many different disquisitions. The idea that silence has become a luxury, that silence has become something that can be sold and that can be actually marketed in many different ways. So the modern cult of silence deals with the fact that our life is really filled with noise, that there is so much noise that we have learned to tune out a certain level of noise to the point that we tune out also important signals and important information. So in order to be able to recover a relationship with the natural world, with the real world, see, told you, yeah, with the real world and even with ourselves, we have learned to deal with so many different facets and apps and methods that enable us to experience silence. The modern cult of silence deals with many different aspects. Oh, sorry. I am in the last sequence. So I was telling you that we've learned to even tune out sounds that are very important. And there are some people, some scientists in our world that actually make sure that we don't lose completely contact with these sounds. You see, one of them is Hildegard Wurzelkamp. You see her there in 1982 interviewing a camel in the desert. And another one is the wonderful Bernie Krause, who invented the word soundscape and spent most of his life going around the world and capturing the sound of nature. The first slide that was at the beginning of the whole presentation tonight comes from an exhibition at the Fondation Cartier that I'll tell you more about it. The really, really sad thing is that Bernie lost all of his archive in the latest California fires. It breaks my heart. I know he was supposed to come. We were supposed to do this salon in June, and we were in touch. He couldn't come. We remained in touch, and I was about to call him again to invite him tonight. And when I saw what had happened, it really broke my heart. So some of that archive is lost. Hopefully, we will be able to recuperate some of it later on. But there are people that make sure we do not lose these kind of sounds that we don't know enough about. And in our Western culture, we've come to value silence so much that we try to learn from other cultures how to value it and how to recreate it. You see here 3 examples of shrines for different religions. One is at MIT, and another one is a non-denominational temple in Tamil Nadu in southern India, and the third is instead a synagogue that doesn't have a cupola, but they all experiment with different facets of a recreation of silence. We could go on forever speaking about silence in architecture and the recreation of silence for other scopes, but truth is, in this day and age, we've come to value silence, or at least quietude, as a real precious luxury. You see here the landscape, the cityscape of Manhattan, with superimposed, and it's faded. So now let's be good Museum of Modern Art curators and let's go to the real thing. This is Catherine Opie's 2009 Sunset. It's a beautiful photograph that in a way condenses so much of what we're looking for. My dad, again, told me another interesting story. Apparently, there was an audiologist here in the United States. His last name was Vernon, and it was several years ago that had a really strong tinnitus. Tinnitus is is almost like a short circuit on the auditory nerve that makes you hear continuously in your head deafening sounds. And he was looking for ways to abate this tinnitus, but in the meantime, he was in Chicago and he couldn't sleep at night, so he would wander around the city. Until one day, he came by a fountain, and he realized that the sound of the fountain, certain sounds coming from nature, help us deal also with tinnitus. So he created the first natural sound machine, which now we use in all different forms, in apps of all kinds, to sleep and to meditate. So this is what we look for most of the time. And last week, Erling Kage came out with a new book. He's a very famous explorer. He's from Norway. He's a friend of my friends here. And he spoke at the new museum just last week, which is very funny. It's funny also to see that we are in tune as curators and as museums. We try to really find out what's going on in the world and bring it to our audiences. But so Silence in the Age of Noise is the new book that he's come out with, and he speaks about the sounds that he has heard in Antarctica and in his explorations. And tonight, later on, we'll speak with Wendy Jacob about her experience of the Arctic Circle, so we'll know more about all that. But silence has become also a way to sell new experiences. We know right now that we are in the age of experience more than products. And for instance, we have silent retreats, we have silent dinners, we have silent quiet zones in trains. It's funny, I was reading an article that said that this journalist used to get into fights only when he was going to sports bars late at night when everybody was drunk. And he said that after he stopped drinking, the only place where he could get into a real fight were the quiet cars on Amtrak, which is absolutely true. They're brutal places. So there are either apps like Budify. How do you pronounce Budify? I mean, there are other more important, more serious apps, but it's very funny to see how we're looking for quiet in every place where we can find it. And it's very funny because I didn't know, but it's not something new. Apparently, the founder of Selfridges in 1909, Harry Gordon Selfridge, had created a quiet room in his department store so that people could go and just calm down before starting to shop again. So it was almost like, it was like take it easy for a moment and then go crazy again. And in 2013, Selfridges actually kind of disingenuously made this no brands. I mean, Naomi Klein would laugh at the no logo claim by Selfridges, but basically they took out the name, the brand Heinz, from all the bottles of ketchup and mustard, of course, and Marmite. Of course, it still looks like what it is, but this idea is that you silence the shouting, the scream of the brand, and you can actually also go into the silent room again. It's kind of Terrellian before Terrell, and it's funny that it is in Selfridges. Come on, okay. So silence can really be boxed in and sold. This work by Danish designer Mads Hagström from 2004, of course, recalls the merda d'artista of Manzoni, but instead of it being poo-poo, it is silence that is bottled and sold as if it were really a commodity. In truth, there's the other kind of silence, and this brutal passage to another kind of silence is done on purpose. In this day and age, we have been dealing with many different types of silence. And of course, there are many oppressed groups in the world that could speak to their own knowledge of silence. Of course, being a woman, albeit too young to have gone through some of the most bloody and difficult fights, but still I've had a few on my skin too, I feel very sensitive and very close to what's been going on for many, many decades in the fight for women's rights. And lately we know that it's become even more powerful of a fight with the Me Too hashtag, which, by the way, is not at all the first hashtag. There were other hashtags before this that were about breaking the silence. And going back into the history of feminism, going back to especially second wave feminism, you can find in your reading list some absolutely powerful, powerful essays that speak to this quality, this deadly quality of silence. They range from the Audre Lorde to also more recently the newly published book, The Mother of All Question by Rebecca Solnit, that contains essays that are truly important for us to grasp and for us to read, because we are going through a really complicated moment when it comes to silence. I'm not able to do this. Oh yeah, I could do it, thank you. In one of her essays, Rebecca also quotes Ray Langton in a very powerful essay in which she talked about three kinds of silence that I find very appropriate, because even though they refer in particular to the notion that pornography silences women, they can be applied to many other different kinds of silence. The first silence is the literal silence of intimidation and defeat, and you can see it. These are silences that you can feel with your whole body. The second is when the speaker lacks a listener and therefore lacks a response. It's almost like an echo in the void. And the third is the silence that happens when one speaks, utters words, but is not able to actually make the action that the word is for happen. It's like the utterance of the word no in the cases of sexual harassment. Silence also can be related to big moments in history that have made it so that it could engender catastrophe. I'm showing you here very different ones. In the middle is Omertà, the silence of the Sicilian people in front of the mafia, and that is an article from the New York Times from 1909. So it's not something recent, but instead on the left-hand side is a much more recent case, which is the case of the silence of Senator, what's the name of the senator, that the Arizona senator that didn't say anything, that was trying to antagonize Trump and that didn't say anything? You know which one? Well, yeah, exactly. So no, it's not McCain, but anyway, it's about the silence of those that let things pass. And then, of course, that amazing book that is Hitler's Willers as Executioners. And then this little cartoon here is Kino, who's an Argentinian cartoonist that used this little character, Mafalda, to kind of communicate his dissent and his discontent during the military regime in Argentina. And you see here Mafalda is doing the classical move, I don't hear, I don't listen, I don't speak. And we grew up in Italy, actually, with this particular character. So it's a character and a struggle that is familiar with us. Even more beautiful is the idea of the spiral of silence, the idea of self-censorship in the face of disagreement with the majority. Interestingly, even though this concept was first introduced by sociologist Elisabeth Noelle-Neumann in Berlin in 1936, lately there's been a lot of discussion about the spiral of silence, in the belief that perhaps social media would enable everybody to speak and everybody to have dissenting voices if need be. But it was proven by a Pew Research study that instead the opposite is happening, that social media create even more of a spiral of silence, which is even more insidious because it is not recognized as such. So silence has this modality, and the silent majority is in truth a very loud and oppressive majority because people do not feel comfortable speaking out. interestingly, speaking up and speaking out is still the secret. Breaking the silence is still one of the most important actions, political actions, that any individual and any community has at their disposal. And consciousness raising is very similar to what feminists were doing in the 1970s, but is now extended to many other groups. We see here also silence as protest. It's a different form that we have seen happen in so many different ages. From the first up left corner is 1917, and it's a protest in New York City against some racial discrimination, racial riots that had happened in St. Louis. And then we move to the BBC, the 1 minute silence because of the journalists that had been imprisoned in Egypt, and many other cases from Ukraine and Crimea all the way to Black Lives Matter. So the idea of silence as a political sign of dissent. Paul Goodman is a wonderful poet of silence, and he describes silence at a much more intimate level, the different kinds of silence, and there are 9 of them that I won't list here, but you should really read the essay because it's quite beautiful. 9 different types of silence that are very much part of our personal experience. And here we're entering an attempt to collect for you a few definitions of silence, impossible as that is. Well, of course, there's Susan Sontag and the aesthetics of silence, and here we're moving slowly but surely into the realm of art and creativity. To Sontag, silence is a way to also find a creative inspiration. And in this beautiful essay that she wrote that is about the aesthetics of silence in Styles of Radical Will, that amazingly indispensable collection of essays, she really formalizes one of the most inspiring ways to think of silence for artists. We move here into the realm of art, and I will need to really ask for the help of my wonderful colleague Stuart Comer afterwards, because I sometimes have a really hard time understanding some of the most intellectual forms of art and sound and music. But of course, Rauschenberg and his white paintings that were such inspiration for John Cage really speak to this modulation and impossibility of true silence, and the fact that no matter what, there's always a way to start from the appearance of silence to build a big oeuvre. And in this case, John Cage used to say that the white paintings to him were almost like airports for lights, shadows, and particles. He saw so much in white and in this absence of color, which, as we know, is the opposite, that it propelled him into a whole work and a whole series of works that we will discuss later, of course. There are many artists that have grappled with representations of sounds, of course, but also representation of silence. There was a beautiful exhibition here at MoMA in 2013 that was called Soundings, and it was done by Barbara London, who was in Stuart's department, that also gathered the work of Christine Sun Kim. Christine is a wonderful artist. She's deaf and mute, and she tried to describe in art the ASL language. And for instance, that piece over there describes the gesture that says all day and tries to really render it in a way that is almost onomatopoeic, but visually so. On the right-hand side, well, Gabriel de Mora Sounds Inscriptions on Fabric is at the top, and on the right-hand side is a better view of the collaboration between United Visual Artists, who is a great design and visualization company in London, and Bernie Krause for the exhibition The Great Animal Orchestra, which was at the Fondation Cartier last year. That was all based on the work of Bernie Krause, and it was all about rendering the sounds of nature, different artists and different interpretations of the same. And of course, there's the work of artists that have wanted to denounce the silence, especially related to the AIDS crisis. You know, we just celebrated AIDS Day about a week ago, and as always happens every year, there's a flourish of examples of work that was really so strong and so important because it was so deeply motivated by an experience that was felt individually and collectively all over the world, and especially in New York City. And actually, the silence equals death T-shirt is also featured in the items exhibition upstairs on the last floor, as is the hoodie, which I did not insert in the presentation today, but somehow also reminded me of this idea of silence and invisibility. Of course, we are really looking forward to hearing from our 4 speakers, because they will enable us to dig deeper into the work and into the issues that we have discussed before. And I can't wait to hear from you and from your questions. So we're going to start. The first person that is going to present is Alexandria Wailes, who is an actress. She has a really great curriculum both in theater and in television, where she's been featured in some of our favorite recurring shows like Law and Order, amongst others, but also really will give us a sense of what it means to communicate, to be an actor, and it doesn't matter with what means and how. Second will be Ola Ronke Akinmowo, who is an artist, a multimedia artist that was born in Brooklyn, and that will tell us about a particular, she's been involved in many different projects, but one in particular is about giving voice to Black women, especially in literature. Then we will have Wendy Jacob, who is a multimedia artist based in Cambridge, who has worked a lot on representing sound and representing silence visually and haptically. And last but not least, we'll have Stuart Comer, who's the Chief Curator of Performance and Media here at the Museum of Modern Art. And then there's going to be you. So I would like to call Alexandria to the podium. And also, wait, I have to introduce all the wonderful ASL interpreters that will be here tonight. This is Debbie. No, Mary. No, you are? No, Mary. So there's Mary, there's Lynette, there's Debbie, and then there's Maria. Maria is over there. Maria is Italian like me, so she will also gesticulate a lot. I'm almost like a sign interpreter too, right? Alexandra, please come.
So at this moment, I will give it a pause. How many of you understood what I just said? If you did, please raise your hand. Can you raise it higher so I can see? I see 2 hands. 3 maybe. 3 hands. 4. Okay. So thank you. So the interpreter is on now. I will just encapsulate what I said. I just came in saying I want to thank Paola and Erica for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful event tonight. And with my esteemed colleagues, I'm very honored to be a part of this. I would like to also thank the interpreters for your time and energy. I just told you a brief synopsis of my career and some famous actors I worked with and a little bit of stories about them. A friend of mine introduced me to an article by Bell Hooks, The Power of Language. When I was reading through this article, it started me on a different kind of intellectual journey. What triggered her to write this, Bell Hooks read Adrienne Rich's poem, The Burning of Paper Instead of Children. And in it, the line that was her trigger was, "This is the oppressor's language, yet I needed to talk to you." That was a very powerful statement. I was thinking about Bell Hooks, her comments about how a person functions in today's world with this in mind. And because I'm a signer, it has particular relevance in my life. I mean, I go through life with so many socio-political dimensions, with multiple identities assigned to me from within and from without. I embrace the challenges and the frustrations as I move through life with my multiple identities. But tonight, what I would like to do is talk about American Sign Language, because I've been using American Sign Language since I was 2 years old. I would like to talk about what I've seen through my work as working as an ASL advisor for television, stage, film, and media. How I've seen my language be worn on a non-deaf body. They're not signers. They're borrowing my language. What does that mean to me? So these are the thoughts that I see people nodding as I'm talking about this, so thanks for your support. So what does this mean to me as an ASL user? I've been doing a lot of ASL consulting, like I said, in the industry, television, media, at the stage. The people I work with are incredible collaborators, brilliant artists, talented, and inspiring. My work with them has been nothing but a wonderful experience. However, there is a however. This is such a particular niche, this nascent field of ASL consultation. We're not sure. I'm just beginning to think about how we view our work in this capacity and how the deaf body is viewed, and how do we keep moving through this work as collaborators, and how do we all become equal collaborators in the creative process? And this is what I've been exploring in some of my work. These are some of the questions that come up. I'll start with my favorite ones. You read lips, right? That's one of my favorites. Here's the other thing that comes up all the time. Is it possible that you can do like less facial expressions? It's a little distracting, a little too much, a little over the top. You know, it just doesn't look natural. Or, you know, I have 2 days to memorize this script. It's a 3-page scene. It's really intense. Oh, and I haven't ever learned sign language, but can you just teach me this, this scene in sign language in an hour? Oh, wait, better yet, can I just film you and I'll take it home and study? Have you ever thought about getting a cochlear implant? Oh, you don't have your own interpreter with you? So these are sort of the familiar menu of questions from hearing people, and then people often ask me, aren't there apps where you can learn sign language? Well, yes, there are apps, but what it lacks is the syntax, the body shift, the facial grammar. All of those elements combined make our language a language. That's what makes people intrigued by American Sign Language. If you take away the aspects of facial grammar, of living in space kinetically, it doesn't have the same appeal. Yes, there are the sign language gloves. It still needs work. It's in development. But when I'm looking at it, okay, what does this mean? Does this mean that I have to go out in public with these gloves, carry more equipment in New York City, and then sign very slowly like this? The gloves don't enhance language. They, dehance it because it only recognizes a few basic hand shapes. It cannot encompass the information of grammar that's on our face and in our body. It's only the hand shapes of words. So that's not a full expression. That's a diminished expression. It makes the language just blocks of words rather than a living language. And that's oppression. And this is the oppressor's language, yet I need it to talk to you. I live in New York City. We all schlep big bags. Listen, we all have our bags in New York. So now I'm going to carry around these sign language gloves for the convenience of you to understand me? I don't think so. So a lot of people often ask me, oh, ASL must be an easy language to learn. But again, it depends on the person. I mean, one of the things I would say when people ask me that is, you must have patience. And people often say, sign language is so beautiful. Oh, yes, it's so beautiful. And I say, yes, it is. It is definitely beautiful, and thank you. But look at the person who's signing. Just like any person who speaks any language. Sometimes it's beautiful, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you hear a person speaking beautiful Italian, beautiful French, beautiful Japanese, and it's like music to your ears, and sometimes it isn't. I appreciate that so many people are eager to learn sign language. I want to encourage that. I want that passion and that enthusiasm to be about our language. But there's a piece that's missing, and that's the social history that is conjoined in our language. How many people are aware or know that our language and deaf people have been oppressed since 355 BC. It began with Aristotle. Aristotle decided the body or a deaf person who cannot speak do not have human rights, because the inability to hear or speak language means the inability to learn. That was his premise. And people now say, oh, ASL is so cool, it's so fun, without knowing that part of the history. And another essential part, that a very cruel part of our history, is at the Milan Conference, where there was a Congress of Educators for the Deaf who gathered in 1800s. And there were, among all the deaf educators, there was only one deaf person in the room. And at that point, they decided that sign language would no longer be the language of instruction, but oral method would be the method of instruction. And sign language would be forbidden in schools and in education. In one room, from 1880s, it was decided that sign language would be banned in education, and that has permeated until now. It still influences us. Yes, there are improvements, but we still have a long way to go. We still have a lot we need to do before we get where we should be in a place of no struggle. There are many wonderful examples where deaf people feel more empowered and in a place to reclaim our language and our identity. I recognize us in by apps that are created from our community, more presence on stage, in film, in television, and more collaboration within the deaf community and outside the deaf community. There's a shift. So let's hope this shift keeps going on. What I want to leave you with is the thought that, what does this mean, the concept of silence? How silence has become a hierarchy for people who can hear. And if you want to know what I was saying earlier without the interpreter, if you want to know what I was talking about, take a look at my website, alexandria.wailes.com. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to start with a quote from Audre Lorde. She says, "When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcome. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak." My name is Ola, and I am a set decorator for film and TV, an interdisciplinary artist, a yoga teacher, a mom, and a librarian. So when I say the word library, I'd like some folks to just shout out what comes to mind when I say library. Someone said reading, and someone said NYPL, books, awesome. Access, awesome. Awesome. Knowledge, exactly. Yes, I believe that the library is all those things and more. And I believe that the library is a tool of resistance, a tool of revolution. And I, in that effort and my love for libraries and books and my own life, created the Free Black Women's Library. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, I'm in control.
You're in control, yeah.
Sweet.
The little green one, the big green one.
Nice. Awesome. So the Free Black Women's Library is an interactive mobile library that currently holds a collection of 900 books, and they're all written by Black women. The library also features readings by authors, performances, film screenings, visual art, creative workshops, and critical conversations. The library pops up monthly, mainly in Brooklyn. I'm a Bed-Stuy girl, and part of the library is kind of like my love letter to my neighborhood and my community. But since I started it, it has grown outside of Brooklyn, and I've taken it to Harlem, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Baltimore. Next weekend, I'm going to Chicago, thanks to the Chicago Public Library being excited about this project. It pops up in free and public spaces like churches, playgrounds, bars, barbershops, museums, anywhere where people gather, anywhere that is accessible by all bodies. That's very important to me, that it's a space for people who walk with a walker or a wheelchair can attend. It's very important to me that it's free, so I never charge for the library. And when I'm working with institutions, I make sure that they don't charge on that day that the library is in their space. So I consider this to be a fugitive radical biblio installation that's on a mission to shift the narrative around the capability and capacity of Black women. It's a public art project that centers and celebrates our creativity, resilience, intelligence, and our imaginations. It confronts the stereotypes and perspectives around the worth and value of Black women. When people think about literature, when people think about writers, and when people think about excellence, oftentimes they unfortunately do not think of Black women authors like Toni Morrison and Alice Walker and Octavia Butler. So part of my mission with the library is to center and celebrate those women, as well as women from modern day like Zadie Smith, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And if anyone's interested in a reading list, you can email me and I'll send you one, some excellent books. So this library shows that we are not a monolith. Black women are expansive. There's not one type of Black woman. There's not one type of anything. And a lot of times we get put in a box. We get put in a specific framework and a specific idea. So the library is about pushing back against that idea and pushing back against objectification and the commodification of our lives. So, in a world that is often attempts to silence and censor Black women, the library is loud and unapologetically and fearlessly taking up space. I started the library in 2015 with 100 books that were all donated from my community and through strangers on social media. And I popped up on a stoop in my neighborhood in Bed-Stuy. So that's the first collection. And since then, it has grown and grown up to now having 900 books. So there are different things that happen at the library. One of them is that we address state violence against Black women. On the right, left, depending on where you're sitting, is an altar that's dedicated to Black women who have been killed by police. So this is part of what we talk about. A lot of times when you think of state violence, when you think of police brutality, the focus is on Black men. And it's not common knowledge that there are plenty of Black women, trans women, who have been brutalized and who lost their lives to police. So part of my mission is to tell their stories. So just a few pictures to show you where the library's been. Every month is a different theme. Every month is a different conversation. This is at Mokata Museum. We talked about Afrofuturism, Octavia Butler, science fiction, speculative fiction, dystopian ideas, an amazing book called Parable of the Sower, which I highly recommend that everyone should read, even if you're not into science fiction. This is at the Concord Church. We talked about a book by Bell Hooks. You've heard her name a couple of times, All About Love. And it's about the complications of showing love, being vulnerable in a world that is filled with racism, classism, sexism, patriarchy. All these oppressive systems are in place, which make it feel somewhat unsafe and challenging to tap into our humanity because we're so busy in defense mode, right? So that's another amazing book, and this was on the steps of Concord Church. This is at Afropunk Music Festival, Black Lives Matter, talking about prisons and abolition and Black Lives Mattering. This is at a community garden, talking about rituals of self-reliance, autonomy, independence, taking care of our own selves so that we can take care of others. And sometimes I call the library fugitive because it's fleeting. Usually it's in a space just for one day, noon to 5, noon to 6. But I've had the blessing and the opportunity to be in a couple of art exhibits where I've been able to launch a full installation. So this is just a quick picture of that at Nurture Art Gallery in Bushwick. This was an exhibit that was about archives and the effect of archives, the importance of archiving. So this is the installation there. So, let me look at my notes. So this is about taking up space, right? So if you're a queer Black woman, if you're a trans Black woman, disabled, poor, you have a chance to share your story. You have a chance to have your story elevated and amplified. And it's also about access. It's about providing access to anyone who's interested, no matter what race, age, or gender, to come to the library and take part in learning about these amazing women. Audre Lorde, Octavia Butler, Marie Evans, Maya Angelou, Zora Neale Hurston, Ntozake Shange, June Jordan, Edwidge Dandikat, Alice Walker. Black women are global. Black women are a diasporic concept. So when I say Black women, I'm not just talking about women from America. I'm talking about Black women from the Caribbean and from the continent and from London, from Germany, from Australia. The way the library works is for every book you bring, you get to take one. So as long as the book you bring is written by a Black woman, you can exchange it. And if you are interested in my Instagram practice, every time somebody brings a book to the library, I take a picture of them with the book they brought and the book they're taking, and I post them on there, and they're so happy and so joyful because they got free books. I have children's books, young adult books, health, beauty, science, politics, arts, architecture, you name it, I have it. So this is my second to last slide, just showing you the energy and the vibration that this is about, and the idea of finding affirmation of our lives in each other, and our allies are also welcome to support us in this work, which is to amplify and be intersectional, be inclusive, be pleasure-filled, be community-driven, be healing. So this is just an attempt, my small attempt, to dismantle and confront, like my first slide said, confront the silence that is often enforced on the voice of Black women by amplifying. Because it's not just about the books, it's about the stories, the art, the film, everything else that comes with it. And you're all welcome to join me anytime to take part in this project by coming to check out the library. You don't have to bring a book to enjoy it. Some people come and they don't have books and they just hang out all day. Some people come with 10 books, they take 10 books and they leave immediately. So everyone has their own vibration. So you can follow me on social media, Tumblr, Instagram, and Facebook. And I'm currently raising money for a bookmobile. So if you like to support in that, it's on CrowdRise. And you can also call me anytime. And email me anytime if you have ideas or suggestions or input, or if you just want to talk about your favorite book written by a Black woman. So I'm going to close with the quote that I started with, which is, when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak. So I'd like everyone to take a nice long deep breath and exhale. And then I'm going to ask you to shout something out. We're going to do a Mad Lib, what I call my Mad Lib affirmations, where I give you a sentence with a blank word and you just have to fill in the word. Since my time is short here, this is going to be a short one. So the affirmation is, I speak blank always. So we'll do call and response. I speak always. Thank you so much.
Hello, I want first to thank Paola and Erica for organizing this beautiful event. So for my contribution to the conversation in silence, I'm going to start with a silent film and a found poem. So the Beaufort scale in reverse. Hold on. Okay. No, I don't need the clicker. Okay. 12, hurricane, devastation, air filled with foam, waves over 45 feet, sea completely white with driving spray. (11) Violent storm, widespread damage, exceptionally high waves, 37 to 52 feet. Foam patches cover sea, visibility reduced. (10) Storm, trees uproot, considerable structural damage, very high waves with overhanging crests, sea white with densely blown foam. (9) Strong gale, Slight structural damage occurs. Slate blows off roofs. High waves, sea begins to roll. Dense streaks of foam. Eight, gale. Twigs break off trees. Wind generally impedes progress. Moderately high waves. Edges of crests begin to break into spindrift. Seven, near gale. Hold trees moving. Resistance felt walking against wind. Sea heaps up. White foam streaks off breakers. Six, strong breeze. Larger tree branches moving. Umbrellas used with difficulty. Larger waves. Whitecaps common. Five, fresh breeze. Small trees and leaf begin to sway. Moderate waves, many whitecaps, some spray. Four, moderate breeze. Dust, leaves, and loose paper lift. Small tree branches move. Small waves, numerous whitecaps. Three, gentle breeze. Leaves and small twigs constantly moving. Light flags extend. Large wavelets. Crests begin to break. Scattered whitecaps. Two, light breeze. Wind felt on face. Leaves rustle. Wind veins begin to move. Small wavelets. Crest glassy. No breaking. One, light air. Smoke drift indicates wind direction, still wind veins. Scaly ripples, no foam crests. Zero, calm. Sea surface smooth and mirror-like. Smoke rises vertically. So the video was published by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and it's a time-lapse recording taken from a satellite, and it starts in June of this year, and it goes till last Thursday. The poem is the Beaufort Wind Scale, which is an empirical measure that relates wind speed to observed conditions at sea and on land, from calm to devastation. And it was developed in 1810 by Francis Beaufort, a British naval officer, to give sailors a common language for describing the wind. And one of the things that I've learned while preparing for this conversation is that there is a close connection between the sea, the wind, and the language of silence and noise. The root of the word silence can be traced to the Norse word sill, meaning standing water, and the Gothic ansalon, meaning the wind dying down. And philosopher Michel Serres says that noise belongs to the same family as nausea, nautical, and navy. He says that the murmuring of the sea is just shy of silence, and that the silence of the sea is mere appearance. I like what Susan Sontag says about silence, that silence demands the presence of its opposite. Just as there can't be up without down or left without right, so one must acknowledge a surrounding environment of sound or language in order to recognize silence. So in a recent installation, I brought the live sounds from outdoors inside by way of transducers attached to studs inside the gallery walls. The gallery was mostly quiet, but if you leaned against a wall, you could experience the rustle of leaves just outside as tactile sound that you hear with your body, but not with your ears. The exhibition was weather dependent. On days when the wind was still, the walls were silent. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Stuart, and I'm hugely grateful to the invitation from Paola and Erica to take part in this evening, and humbled to be in this incredible company. And my presentation is slightly diverted from what I was originally considering, which actually was a little bit all over the place. But as somebody dedicated to working with artists who do work with sound, and I always fight the category of visual arts, given that so much of the work that I'm charged with representing makes sound. And it's a major consideration when dealing with art galleries that are not always acoustically engineered or designed to be really useful spaces for this kind of work. And as we're embarking on a major expansion at the moment at the museum, I've had really incredibly inspiring meetings with acoustic engineers and others, and have learned a great deal just about the science and the new technologies of making things silent. So in addition to that, sort of those recent experiences, I've also been working a lot with artists like Lawrence Abu Hamdan, who's a young Lebanese artist who's specifically interested in the politics of listening and in forensic sound. So he actually is employed by governments and legal agencies to do investigations into things that we would all perceive as silent, but within which new truths can be found that are often very useful to certain legal cases. And I've also spent a great deal of time working with artists like Pauline Oliveros, who is very committed to the notion of deep listening, again, listening for sounds in perhaps spaces or situations in which we might not normally hear them. But in a way, that finally led me to something that I think resonates perhaps more with some of the presentations you already heard this evening. And perhaps in the spirit of these R&D salons, this is not a presentation on work that I've already really delivered or conducted, but maybe a few coordinates of some artists I've been thinking a lot about, and new ways of maybe thinking about specific works that, again, I'm very grateful for the invitation to do this, because it's made me rethink connections between sound, silence, and dissonance, but also a key group of African-American artists working over the last 30 years, and perhaps unexpected conjunctions with some of the key composers of the last 50 years, particularly those dealing with minimalism. And I wanted to begin with this image because Okwuenewezour's Venice Biennale that took place 2 years ago was partly founded on his notion of the importance of oratory or the oratorical and ways in which art could take on a new political charge by speaking to us with a political voice that he was very invested in. For me, the biennial had mixed success in doing that, but there were a few moments that I found incredibly powerful, and I'm going to show you two works from that show that for me were powerful specifically because they dealt with what I would call silent oratory. They didn't speak, they didn't make a sound, but sounds were implied, or certain kinds of scores were implied, many of which had a very political charge. So first you see Terry Atkins' Muffled Drums. Hopefully many of you will have seen the exhibition that took place as part of our project series earlier this year, curated by Achille Tomasino in our Department of Painting and Sculpture, on the Lone Wolf Recital Corps, which was an organization of artists convened by Terry Atkins, who would often activate these kinds of objects. Again, as a curator dedicated to works in performance and media, frequently we do acquire works of art that are meant to be activated. Most of the time they sit in our storage or in our archives or our digital databases in complete quiet, of course. So it's our job to really rediscover new ways of giving them a voice and making them inhabit the present as much as they do the past. I think Terry Atkins' work speaks to that very powerfully. But this work in particular is part of a series called the Dark Water series, which specifically investigated the speeches of W.E.B. Du Bois. And particularly this work dealt with his anti-lynching campaign. As part of that, it was actually activated once, but generally it's presented as you see here in the Biennale, in the Arsenale, as a sort of sentinel that stands silent, implying a history of African-American marching corps, but never really articulates that through sound, only through the suggestion of these muffled drums. A few galleries down from the Atkins work were a series of paintings from Glenn Ligon's Come Out series. Come Out is specifically derived from Steve Reich's score Come Out, which, as many of you know, was rooted on the experience of Daniel Hamm, one of the Harlem Six, who was brutalized by police in 1964. And specifically the quote that Steve Reich narrowed in on when he was asked to compose a score for a benefit concert at Town Hall here in New York that took place in 1966. Focused in on a recording from the legal procedures around this case on this specific sentence that Daniel Hamm had uttered. Quote, "I had to, like, open the bruise up and let some of the bruise blood come out to show them." So Reich took a two-channel recording of this, and then gradually as the piece progresses, it focuses in on the phrase "come out." And as the two tracks continue to play off of each other and one sort of fades in and out in contrast to the other, it becomes very discordant and basically destroys the intelligibility of the words. In the Ligon, you see, much like his work has done for many years, there's language is built up in layer upon layer upon layer until it almost obscures the actual words, often dealing with notions of blackness in particular. And in this case, the score is again presented silent. So I think this is a really powerful articulation of the experience of the Reich piece. But again, you never hear it. You don't hear the score. You experience it in silence. So this kind of encounter with language as it breaks down, further breaks down what one might have experienced if one does know the original score. Which brings us, of course, to John Cage. And 4 minutes 33, this is the earliest existing score for the piece, which is in MoMA's collection. My colleague David Platzker curated a great show a couple of years ago that really dug into a deeper context for this work. So I would urge you to look at the exhibition history pages on MoMA's website to find out a bit more. But specifically, this is the work that really revolutionized how Cage impacted our ability to really rethink whole histories of Western musical composition, and also to think about you, the audience, because the score was not producing sound through the performer who sits silent, conducting the three movements of the piece in utter silence at a piano, but actually it's the sounds that you, the audience, make that really produce the oral landscape of the piece. I'm not going to go into a long treatise on John Cage. Of course, his 1961 collection of writings called Silence is a major reference point for any conversations on the subject of quiet. But I'm more interested in this case in how Cage, again, relates to this small cluster of African-American artists I wanted to discuss. Pope L is an artist now based in Chicago, but this was a project he did that was co-curated by my colleague here, Thomas Lax, and Adrian Edwards from Performa and the Walker Art Center in 2013. And it was a 25-hour reading of Cage's Silence that took place effectively with two desks in the space. Many of the readers opted not to actually read the words, but to sit in silence in homage to 4 minutes and 33. So again, a reading that was conducted partly in silence. But what was also quite radical about this reading is towards the end, around 11 o'clock in the morning on the following day, it began around 10 o'clock the previous day in November, Pope L shifted to the other desk and decided instead to read a short lecture tribute to the gay African-American minimalist composer Julius Eastman. And Eastman here, I think, is a critical figure to consider, given that his career and his oeuvre had remained in silence for a very long time, for decades, until several bursts of recognition occurred over the last few years, again, including in Okwui Uwezor's Venice Biennale, where his performance for 4 pianos, Crazy Nigger, was performed. Eastman notoriously re-performed a major score of John Cage, and as he did so, undressed his boyfriend on stage. Cage was not pleased about this and said, "Why do people think they can interpret my work any way they want?" Unfortunately, Julius Eastman became homeless at a certain point in the 1980s, and he was temporarily took refuge in Tompkins Square Park. This was shortly before the notorious Tompkins Square Park riots, protesting police activity which tried to displace those homeless people living there. Popel also did this legendary performance, Tompkins Square Crawl, in direct response to that situation. It's one of several crawl pieces in which he talks about going horizontal or losing verticality in an otherwise highly vertical city, New York City. Of course, adopting the position of a homeless person. And as he did the crawl, he really wanted to do so in total silence. When people would interrupt him and say, "What are you doing?" he would say, "Working," and then leave it at that. But one of the reasons I also wanted to show this piece is I think it relates strongly to a piece he did specifically about silence and language that I had the honor of working with him on when I was working in London in 2003. Actually, that should say 2003, not 2013. He did not speak for about 2.5 days, from the moment he landed at Heathrow until he took the podium at Tate Modern. He did not utter a single word to anybody. I just wanted to quickly show you a clip of what happened when he finally took the podium. So effectively, language is broken. It breaks down after this experience of existing in total silence. The language itself becomes completely distorted, almost like his body did during the crawl pieces. I think also it's important to make the connection back to the Steve Reich score or to the Glenn Ligon paintings of this idea of language breaking down, becoming indistinct, becoming violently abused. And I also just finally wanted to show this last very short clip of the same performance being interpreted. And so the effort to try to translate what is a nonsensical language into something coherent or into something meaningful. I think at this moment in which any notion of truth seems to have become extremely uncertain, this is a strategy that could be a very useful one, and is quite radical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's go and sit all together. Oops. So we know Alexandria is the very last one, right? Alexandria, you are switch. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. And then we have Wendy, we're here. Ola is here, and here I am. Well, I have to say, thanks to your absolute brilliance, we were able to cover, because I was having silence FOMO, you know. I was like, oh my God, we didn't talk about isolation, and then you talked about isolation. We didn't talk about, you know, keeping people away from voting and education, and then you did talk about that, so it's good. We covered a lot, but there's also a lot that we did not cover. So taking a little bit of the lead from everything that you've told each other, do you have questions for each other that matured as you were listening?
I mainly have appreciation.
Well, appreciation, of course. There's always so many, but it's really quite incredible how much you've been able to cover. Yes, Stuart.
I mean, I was so happy you showed the slide of Audre Lorde's transforming silence into action. And I think that speaks to Ola's presentation, certainly. And maybe Ola could just talk a little bit about, again, I think one of the things one could have answered when you asked, what do you think of when you hear the word library, is shh.
Oh my God, nobody said that. It's not like that anymore, right?
Right.
Interesting.
But that notion that a library is an incubator and that silence is an incubator, and what happens after that period of incubation, and this also speaks, I think, to the Popel piece, radical things emerge. And I'm wondering maybe what your experience has been, like how the library has activated people through the power of silence.
Well, it's kind of interesting because it's true that oftentimes when I say, what do you think of when you think of library, people think of this very quiet space, and also people think of a very safe space, and I think that's part of what my project is interested in, not so much creating a safe space, because I personally don't believe in that idea, but creating a brave space or a sacred space where people can gather and exchange ideas and kind of grow and build off of each other. A lot of times I do have educators come into the library, people who teach on the college level and the high school level, who are English teachers, literature teachers, and aren't even aware that their syllabus and their curriculum doesn't have Black women authors listed in their writings, and coming to the library kind of like sparks something for them to kind of recognize that that's important, regardless of what community they're teaching and they're serving. It's important to have different voices in the room. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
It helps.
By the way, the senator I was forgetting was Jeff Flake. I mean, how could I forget? So this leads me to ask a question of anybody who wants to answer. The relationship between silence and democracy lately has been really complicated. But is silence a necessary component of a healthy democratic system? That's what we were wondering. So the author of one of the readings that was in the list, he was political scientist Polonsky, I'm sorry, that was a nice slip, argued that while the internet may have positive implications for political participation, it's also causing problems for leaders and for non-leaders. They have been elected through time-honored democratic systems, but now find themselves vulnerable to the whim of the baying internet mob. So is there such a thing as a democracy with too many voices? Mm-hmm. And so this is a multifaceted question. Does anybody want to tackle it?
I'll offer one personal contribution,
yes,
just based
please.
on recent events. When the Not Surprised letter went out, which was a response by women in the art world to the abuse of power in the workplace, there was a discussion about a group of men responding in solidarity and offering a letter of solidarity. And I actually thought it was better to stay quiet and be silent, and that women have fought for generations to have a voice, to have that voice, and that it wasn't the moment to mansplain. It wasn't the moment to speak over that very powerful letter. There's time, and I think social media creates this incredible pressure to have to respond immediately. And I think there are times when standing back and being quiet is voicing solidarity and mm-hmm. support. And so, silence can be a voice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes. Thank you for that. Any questions that are popping up from the audience? Because I know that there are so many people that have really pondered this subject. So let's start with there, and then we'll come here. So, yeah, White Scarf. Can you introduce yourself also?
Yes. My name's Pradnya Desai.
Oh, Pranya, hi.
Hi.
Okay. The house lights on so that you can be seen. Okay. Is it possible to have the house lights on?
There they are.
Up in the
slowly.
booth, please? All right. Yeah.
Hi.
Are they on enough? Can you see Alexandria? Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So my question is for Alexandria. I was very struck by something you said towards the very end of your presentation. I might not get this verbatim, but silence is a hierarchy that's created by those who can hear. And I was very struck by that because it reminded me of a couple of things from the visual arts, but from a kind of historical period. Two artists, both of whom have a kind of history of silence. One was Martin Ramirez, who spent most of his time in a correctional facility in California and made works on paper using materials that he found in prison. The other artist is James Castle, who was born and raised in Idaho. And both of these artists have had museum retrospectives at major museums in the United States. James Castle was born without speech and without the ability to hear, and was given the opportunity to learn sign language, but patently refused throughout his childhood and also throughout his adolescence. And Martin Ramirez was diagnosed as being catatonic, and he did not speak for most of his life in both the correctional facilities that he lived in the United States. He was originally from Mexico. And ultimately it was discovered that he was not catatonic. He chose not to speak. And so your comment made me think of these two artists who have kind of used silence in their own ways. But also sort of, for me, how does that reflect on, for me personally also, kind of in the history of art, we have minimalism, which has been a very, very visual minimalism, not music, very male, and very much dependent on a kind of hierarchical relationship to silence in a way, visual silence. And I was wondering if you had perhaps something to contribute to my comments, because for me, the silence of Ramirez and Castle is very poignant and very powerful and very different from the kind of hierarchical silence that you broached at the end of your presentation.
Yes, thank you for bringing both those artists
I'm very
to
sorry
light.
for the
Yes.
long question comment.
Oh, no, please. It's amazing. Thank you so much. As an actress, as a person who does a lot of stage work, some film and television as well, I'm just wondering how many of you here could name 20 deaf actors who are
20?
currently working? 20
No.
deaf actors, right. I think that states my case. How many could do 5? How many could do 1?
Yeah. Marley Matlin.
Marley Matlin,
Yeah.
there you go, which is awesome.
Of
I've worked
course.
with her as well, she's awesome. But to me, that already shows the hierarchy, right? We can only deal with one artist, one deaf artist at a time. I mean, it's wonderful that she's female, that's great, but one represents the all, and she doesn't represent the whole community, the diversity in our community. So that to me is an act of silence. It's a silence of all the diversity in our community. So from within our community, a very diverse community, is who's responsible for pushing the envelope? Who's responsible? I mean, it seems, or is this acceptable in our community? Or is only one person enough to deal with? Only this one token? Is that enough for everyone to deal with? So the act of nothing, I mean, that we've done no action. Nothing has changed in 40 years. That's very disturbing. That's very disturbing that I don't see representations of any of us out there, or known out there, recognized out there. How many hearing actors of color can you name? 20? You might have to take a beat to think of 20, but I bet you could come up with the names. But deaf male or deaf female, either one, it takes a moment. We're out there, we're working, we're all trying to be visible, but that visibility is silencing, because we're not visible to you.
So maybe we're still in Aristotle times, huh? Mm-mm. There was a gentleman over there.
Hi, my name is Edward Ziff, and my question is for Ola. So I'm very impressed by your library and your engagement with the community. And I wondered, have you or your library considered encouraging people in the community to write themselves rather than to rely solely on published authors, because I'm sure these people must have many marvelous stories to tell.
Definitely, definitely. One of the things that the library does is actually writing workshops. For instance, last month at the Studio Museum of Harlem, I led a short story writing workshop where I started it out by reading Zora Neale Hurston's short story Sweat. It's an amazing short story. And also a short story by Jamaica Kincaid called Girl. So I read those two stories and performed them, and then we did a workshop. And the idea around that, in addition to telling their own stories, we talked about identity, and we talked about culture, and we talked about language being culture, and how to tell a story or to share anything about ourselves, it doesn't necessarily need to be in this perfect grammar. And part of what makes us special and interesting and layered as people is that we have taken the English language and we can change it. So for instance, Sweat is written in like a Geechee Gullah kind of Southern text, and Girl is more Caribbean patois, right? So it gives people the opportunity to understand that they can tell their story in a way that makes sense to them. So at the end of the workshop, people actually shared their stories with each other, and it was extremely beautiful and extremely profound. So that's part of the work, is not just elevating these iconic Black women writers, but also having people understand and recognize that they are just as unique, special, important, as valuable as any of these women, and they can have as much impact as any of these women on their community and society at large.
Thank you. Maria? And
Thank
then
you.
you come next.
So we've heard some wonderful, poignant things about silence in the sense of silencing, which has this oppressive, punitive connotation. But I wonder about the other side of silence as this generative space where one's inner voice becomes audible. I recently spent 3 weeks in the woods in complete silence and solitude, and also without any internet, which was transformative. But then I came back to New York, and I was struck by the assault of noise that we habitually tune out just to survive. It was very noticeable, just the helicopters, the sounds, and then I opened my computer and the same thing came out of the computer, the analogy of what we experienced on the internet. And so I just wonder, what is the space for that? And also silencing, we're talking about as a sort of imposed from the outside and sometimes self-chosen, but silence is not a solitary experience. It cannot be a solitary experience. Quietude can be, but silence is a social experience. And how in this society do we experience silence?
Well, this is maybe Wendy, Arctic, the Arctic Circle project. I mean, you've been trying also to experience that, both from an auditory and from an internal experience viewpoint.
So a number of years ago, I went up to the Arctic, the North Pole, with the ambition just to listen to ice. And I was just really curious about what ice would sound like. So I drilled holes in the ice and put in a little hydrophone and listened. And I didn't hear anything. And then I put the hydrophone over into the water, over the edge of the boat, where there's lots of ice, all these little icebergs and bergy bits, which are like the little bits that break off that are floating. And there it was like really loud. And the noise was from the ice. So the glacier, it takes about 4,000 years to go. When the snow falls, then it gets compressed and it builds up, and then it eventually moves into the sea, where it breaks off into the sea. And during that time, all of those little bubbles of air caught in there, 4,000-year-old bubbles of air, are super compressed. And then when they hit the relatively warm Beaufort Sea, they explode. And so you hear the pop, 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 and it's like popcorn or something. And it's just 4,000-year-old air just escaping. So that was the noise that I found in the ice. And so I guess it was the ice not in a static state, but in a as it's changing forms, that it released it made it sound. But there's also a lot of other interesting sounds in the ocean, and there's a marine biologist, Sheila Patek, who discovered that shrimp communicate even though they don't have ears.
Yeah,
And this is something that's very interesting because because most crustaceans don't have ears, it's long been assumed that they don't hear. But in fact, it's very lively that they hear vibration through their bodies, and they communicate. They both receive and transmit information.
But I'm sorry, Maria, because I kind of took it in a different direction. I really wanted
sorry.
to ask her about the Arctic Circle. But instead, when it comes to this place of inner discovery, it's something that I wouldn't even be able to answer to because I don't know that kind of silence. How many of you do know that kind of silence, that place of self-quietude? And let's see, raise your hands. Whoa, I so don't believe you. You're just like, you do. So, all right, is there somebody that can contribute a real moment of experience? Okay, all right, there we go. Then we're going to return I promise that I'm going to return the microphone to you, I remember.
My name is Annette Scheich, and I would say I try to experience silence every day because I meditate every morning, and even though it's a process of relaxation and letting go, every morning it's a struggle because there's so much. Just as the experience of coming back from 3 weeks in the silence, the noise in the head never stops. So you have to find ways of just putting it away for a while and just think about nothing. And it's really hard, but it's very helpful to do it every day. And we're supposed to do it twice a day. I can do it once because the day then takes over, but it really changed my life.
How many of you here meditate daily? Okay, this is a little more honest. Okay. I tried so desperately, but there's no way. Stuart, about this. Oh, Alexandria?
Can I make a quick comment about
Sure.
the silence, talking about meditation,
Yes,
talking
please.
about the authentic experience, the calmness that we're referring to. I think that in yoga practice, Ola, you know as a yoga teacher, several of my teachers have told me it's not so much about pushing it away or pushing away the noise. Allow it to pass. Allow it to pass. That's the process. In that process, you'll find that moment of calm. That calm could be interpreted as silence, but it's not necessarily silence.
Well, I understand. My personal experience is a little silly, but the app that I use the most is not mindfulness, it's white noise. I really use it so much, especially in Italy when I find the assault of people speaking on cell phones in Italy really unbearable. So I just go around because I'm just trying. It's not the noise, it's the language that I find distracting and invasive. It's very interesting. So maybe silence, the silence that you experienced on the island, which I'm sure was not silent at all, was the silence of people filling silence with random and not necessarily pertinent words or information.
I want to ask you, though, was it the silence of the woods, or was it the silence of you not talking that affected you?
Well, it's the combination, I think. Part of it was the relief of the pressure to be responding, which I think hijacks our capacity for silence a great deal.
Right.
So in deliberately not engaging with the world, not speaking to live humans, not having the internet, having that pressure lifted, a certain kind of inner silence sets in. But I will say definitely the woods help. I was in a place with ancient mossy vegetation that was there when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, and something about that just grounds you.
So the gentleman over there, thank you.
Hey.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, yes, yes. My name is Eric, and kind of a general question to whoever wants to participate or answer. So it seems like throughout the conversations, there's kind of a thread of the failures of institutions, of whether the library or kind of like whether they're like the lack of depth actors of these kinds of failures. But institutions are kind of also the most silent. Like we can kind of protest, but a lot of times they can kind of, you know, evade the question or just say no comment. So I'm kind of interested in this question of silence and connection to power in the sense that, you know, not having to be accountable to the public or not having to answer. So I don't know who has thoughts about that.
Okay, this was a multi-layered question because, first of all, our press office will tell you no comment is a big comment. It's like, you know, you better just not be available, like, you know, be on vacation, etc. So silence as unaccountability, that's what you were talking about. Well, this opens a can of worms here, right? Where do we start from? Silence as unaccountability. Anybody wants to?
I'm going to try to connect what Eric just brilliantly asked with what Wendy spoke about. I want to go with your very good question about publicness and isolation. And I'm just imagining the recent horrifying news about wildlife preserves in Alaska now being compromised by fracking and other measures that are enacted in silence. You know, the tax bill went through the other night at 4 in the morning while we were all asleep in silence. So silence can be quite deadly, whether it's because you're silent and out of a lack of power or because you're enacting your power through silence. But as these regions like the Arctic or Alaska, or, you know, places that conventionally have been seen as free of humanity or somehow quiet, peaceful, are now being compromised in the name of technologies that will only fuel greater publicness. So somehow, I just think there are perhaps slightly frightening ways of connecting all these threads.
So we're kind of covering the planet with this kind, with our demands on nature and on other human beings to respond to our arrogance and to our invasion and invasiveness. Well, see what you started there? So there's one here, and then I'll come to you. Oh. Him first, yeah. And then you. Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, my name is Jay, and I'm deaf and a composer. So you've talked about silence in its own right and silence as oppression. What I'm curious about is silence as preparations, silence as the moment before something happens. When you saw the icons for silence equals deaf for the AIDS movement, and you think about the civil rights movement, it was all using silence to prepare. In music, the most important part of music is actually the rest, because the rest create the blank space between those other moments. So I would be fascinated to hear, you know, how can we discuss silence as preparation or as a tool for action? And also, in Alexandria's case, you know, what is silence in terms of sign language? You know, where is the silence? Because as a scientific matter, sound is all based on movement. So I'm just curious if that's accurate for her. I hope that made sense.
Yeah.
I do think I don't think signing is silent. Absolutely not. Listen to me. I make a lot of noise when I sign onto my body. I touch my body. And even when I'm in conversation with someone, our face is noisy, right? Look at my face. There's all this information there. What that just said is, yes, I agree with you. What are you thinking? And so it's not silent. If I turn away and look at a corner and I'm not looking at you, then it's silent, right? To me, that becomes silent. So when I break away from where the visual information is, then it becomes silent. I can feel what's happening, and the motion I know makes noise, no matter how small it is. It's sound, no matter how quiet I try to be, or as loud as I want to be when I sign. And again, it depends on the person, but we all make different, we have volumes of different degrees in our signing. I'm an actress, so I'm always in preparation for something, in regards to your question about rest and silence.
It's very interesting. While you were speaking, I was thinking, I don't think it happens anymore, but once upon a time, they used to fire a gun when a race would start, right?
Yeah.
And the moment before is when you gather all your energy, whether you're on a car or whether you're a runner. I was just thinking of the coil compressing in order to then release. Anything you want to, yeah? You
Oh
want to
yeah,
add
well I was going to
something?
say, like, this is a very fascinating and beautiful conversation, because I feel like it's bringing me back to this idea about perspective, because silence can be so many things. I was also on a retreat in New Mexico for 10 days. It was a silent retreat, and that was my first time being in that type of environment in complete silence, and I found myself without that responsibility of having to respond or pay attention to anything, just dreaming, remembering my dreams when I woke up in the morning, writing songs, writing poetry, things that I have no time for when I'm going through the hustle bustle of New York. So that silence in that moment afforded me a lot of joy, a lot of pleasure, a lot of healing. But then there's this other version of silence, which we've talked about, which feels like a dismissiveness, which feels like censorship, and then we have this concept of silence with music, which really turns me on. I love that idea. And also, just as a yoga teacher, the breathing that takes place before anything, like even tonight, being nervous, having to speak here, and right before, just taking that moment of silence within myself and that deep breath, like,
Oh, I do the same.
here you go. So it's, for me, it's kind of reminding me of how I feel about money, how I feel about time. They're just very kind of fluid concepts, and depending on from where you're standing and how you're looking at it, it's like they can work against you or work for you. So it's like this, not even a double-edged sword, it's like a multi-edged sword that's attached to it.
Also, to your question, there's a wonderful filmmaker, experimental filmmaker in London named Liz Rhodes. And she was the only woman invited to be in a major exhibition at the Hayward in 1976 on histories of experimental film. And in the end, after trying to convince them to include more women, pulled her work, which was all about music, and opted to write a catalog essay collectively with 12 other women about the exclusion of women and how there was a need to invent a new language to describe their work on their terms. But she prior to that had made a two-screen film performance called Light Music. And using the optical reader in the projector, there are bands of light and dark on the film strip, and as they go through, there's no recorded sound. What you hear is literally the sound of light and dark going through the projector. So the stop that you mentioned in music is also a moment, is like the blank between the cells of a film strip. So what you see is what you hear, and I love that idea of lightness and darkness having an equivalent acoustically or orally. It's a very powerful piece.
It's also the space between words. Like, I love
Yeah.
the idea of the rest. And like, without a space between words, we'd have a really hard time understanding each other. And so I really appreciate what you say, that in music, that the rests are some of the most important part.
Yes. And where you put the space in between words can determine how your words are interpreted.
Yes.
You were about to ask.
I was just sorry, and the whole point of that piece was the absence
I'm sorry,
of women.
I
No,
interrupted you.
I forgot. But that piece was inspired by the absence of women in conventional histories of classical music in Europe. So it was a direct challenge to that. Anyway. Again, another
First
form
of all,
of
thank you
silence.
so much for an extraordinary conversation. My name's Freddie, and I wanted to revisit the conversation about silence and accountability, and bring that back to something you mentioned in terms of can you have democracy with 7 billion voices, right? And so my question is, what is the objective of this envisioned democracy with 7 billion voices, right? 7 billion today, what's it tomorrow? How do these systems even work? What is the fiction that we're working towards?
Who wants to answer this? It's a very easy question.
I think maybe that was the point of my presentation. If you take the Steve Reich piece, which is all about one voice speaking to another voice and then contradicting and canceling each other out effectively, but then that accumulates into something that is its own language. It's a new language, which is also, I think, what Popel was trying to
exactly.
do.
I'm thinking also of that. It becomes a form of white noise, and it becomes, and also because we adapt as human beings, unfortunately, I'm afraid that we also adapt to this noise, and therefore we muffle our sensitivity, and we kind of do the opposite of fine-tuning. We kind of dumb down our critical sense, and that's, in my opinion, what's going on right now with the news we get every day about our commander-in-chief and what he's done in the past 12 hours. We kind of dumb ourselves down, and that's probably one of the hardest and most difficult problems that we have today. And maybe that's what artists could really help us with by giving us this kind of, I don't know, maybe conditioning sessions that bring us back to a kind of base level of hearing and understanding that then resensitizes us and makes us able to speak up when necessary. I don't know if that's even possible. Or maybe those sessions of silence, at least human silence, help us with that. How was it when you came back from the 3 weeks? Were you more ready to protest and to do something active politically, or the opposite?
If anything, I was more aware of the cacophony of voices that are speaking without saying much effectively.
Yes.
Now that's an important.
Yes,
so
and
I'm going to go. I'm sorry.
Alexandria, excuse me, just tagging onto what you said. I wonder if it would be possible to have sessions of how about the human experience. I'm just thinking about what you were saying. We're talking about the cacophony, the visual and oral cacophony. We're so overstimulated with information that we, like you said, we get dumbed down. I'm just wondering, what I see every day as I live in New York, I see how people are moving physically through the city. It's changed. I've lived here for 14 years. I see the change of people are walking like this. They're like zombies. There's no sense of space between each other. There's no sense of your surroundings.
It's the tourists.
Oh, well, I would like to believe, I'd like to believe that. I have to say there's some of them are New Yorkers too. But this to me is fascinating to see this lack of sort of spatial awareness and how much it's taken over our existence. I would love to have sessions to shake up and wake up our and acknowledge what's happening to us in our surroundings, physical and other dimensions.
Before I pass the word to everybody else, you know what I was thinking? There's another detox method. There's something in between pure silence or solitude and cacophony. There's dialogue. And I have to say that I get my inspiration space is not silence within myself, but it's a conversation with one person, maybe two, that get my juices flowing. And luckily enough, I have several. And that's to me the most efficient and most most corroborating way to do that detox. So let's see, we had Dorothy. Wow, so many. Okay, Dorothy, and then there was somebody there. Dorothy is blonde and with the glasses in the middle. And then there was somebody over there, and then we'll go backwards.
Thank you. I'm Dorothy Dunn, and I'm helping with a project. Bhutan is currently building their first public library in their
where? Who?
Bhutan,
Oh, Bhutan.
which we think of as incubating the idea of gross national happiness. But the library they're building is called the Library of Body, Mind, and Sound. And I'm curious from the multiple perspectives on the stage right now, and certainly in this room, what's the potential for a library like this on a global scale that is integrating what in our society we tend to separate from the libraries with verbal literacy and the museums that are about visual literacy, what
We'll ask
bridges
the
can we
librarians.
build?
Librarians.
Oh, no, I mean, yeah.
No, everybody.
No judgment on them, but I think it's exciting that there's in a culture that uses silence and appreciates the resonance of the universe so much. What does it mean that they're building their first library, public library, and having it also be about sound?
Well, I'll say quickly that that sounds wonderful to me. One of the things that I like to remember in my own work with the library is that not everyone can read a book, not everyone's literate, so there are different ways to receive information, and sometimes it is through sound, sometimes it's through movement, sometimes it's through an art piece. And that type of library sounds more efficient in terms of, it sounds inclusive, it sounds accessible for all. So I'd love to check it out. Yeah, definitely. And just getting to, someone mentioned earlier about systems and voices. I think one way that all beings can move toward this society that you said is fictional, I caught that, is understanding that the people who have the least power are the people that we don't hear from. Mm-hmm. So, like you said, making space for other voices, recognizing that if you're in a position of power, you can use that, you can turn that power over to someone else to just amplify their voices, amplify their stories, and check in with people in terms of considering yourself an ally, really plugging into whatever your passions are, whatever your interests are, plugging into those communities, those organizations, and seeing where you can offer support. And social media is an amazing tool. Part of the reason why my library is the way it is because of social media. I put out a call for books, and I get books from all over the world from people I don't even know saying, I want you to have this. So I think we have potential to create the world that that will make us all feel good to live and be in it, and that we can all thrive and feel supported. I'm an optimist.
We can tell. It's over there.
Hi, my name is Michaela, and I guess I wanted to go back to the shrimp, and I had a question.
Back to the shrimp, yeah.
Well, because we do have so much to learn from like non-human beings and different, like quite literally different forms of silence. So I was wondering, like, just opening up the full like synesthetic potential, like within each of your research, what is a kind of like paradigm or different form of like the silence noise spectrum that you would argue for?
I mean, I know of designers, synesthesia has become almost an obsession for so many designers. So, but you're the speaker, so you answer. Just like trying to use all the tools of our disposal and not stopping at one sense for every kind of output.
Or realizing that sound is so much more than just what you get through your ears. And
definitely.
Something
It's
really
all
interesting is
vibrations.
the lowest note on a church organ in a really large cathedral is below the level of human audition. And so it's strategy. It's so you feel you feel God or you feel something, but you don't hear it with your ears.
I would mention, there's obviously histories of art like Kandinsky and others going back to the early 20th century where synesthesia was central to their work. But I would really want to call out Pauline Oliveros, again, who passed away, I think, about a year ago. But we actually, not in this room, but in one of our other cinemas, did a piece called To Marilyn Monroe and Valerie Solanas in honor of their desperation. And the actual score or diagram is a fantastic kind of graphic image, but then in actuality it's performed again by the audience. And so the way that a simple two-dimensional design can become a social experience, I find very powerful.
Great. So a lady in the middle with the curly hair. behind Dorothy. I mean, we're using our localizations, coordinates here.
Hello, my name is Carrie Love. I actually realized that my understanding of sound is really that sound only exists in relationship. We only hear sound when something comes in contact with another thing. And so I don't think I really conceptualized this before this conversation, that silence and our relationship to silence is also in direct contact. So all of these gradients of things we're talking about, silence as quietude versus silence as oppression, is about our relationship to the silence, whether or not we have agency and control. And so I think when I look at all of this and I see my relationship changing with different silences, and one extreme end was the silence of torture, that you literally have no control over the silence that is being imposed upon you. Whereas the other end, I think, is luxury, and we talked about the luxury end. So now when I think about luxury and control, the place I get to is luxury and complicity. Mm-hmm. And whether or not right now in the society the way it is, whether or not complicity is a form of luxury, to not have to speak is your luxury.
Complicity is a form of luxury. I like, I could follow really well the first part of your argument, and then I lost you when you equated complicity with luxury. But when it comes to luxury is usually based on an idea of scarcity, whether real or kind of marketed, just like thinking a diamond is forever. That was something that was marketed by De Beers in the middle of the century because diamonds are not as scarce as they seem. So I was able to get to that, but then complicity as luxury, I don't know.
I think I know what you mean. I think the more expensive the car, the less you hear the sound of the door shutting behind you.
I don't know. I'm going to disagree with that. And actually, my friend here just pointed out, maybe I mean privilege, that the luxury of silence is enabled by your privilege. Mm-hmm. And that allows you to be complicit.
Okay.
So there's this relationship between all of these structures.
You're kind of pulling your arm so much because you want to answer her?
But
oh, no, because otherwise I'll get to you.
Alexandria wants to pipe in. She says, well, okay, it's very funny as a deaf person, right? So I think it's a luxury. That silence is in me already. I have the bliss. I just can't hear. So, there are different viewpoints about is that a luxury or not a luxury, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Complicity is
I did want to actually comment on that.
Okay, go for it.
I'm Paul. I'm a noisy fashion designer. And I've been thinking about the commodification of silence that we've been talking about, the retreat, the spa. It really comes from a relationship to maybe a monastic experience where that quietness became almost associated with godliness, where there was a fetishization of the silence. And I think about a particular community that was silent, the Lutheran religious communities in Germany that went from an intrinsic positive quietness to a fairly, I think arguably negative complicity by not speaking out. There was a moment of inversion when they went from being quiet and contemplative to quiet and complicit. And it does feel that we are using occasionally silence as a palliative or an escapist mechanism. It begs the question if in that context was silence ever good, or was?
Interesting. Well, I think we've gotten to our 8 o'clock mark, which means we can go and have our delicious wine and fabulous and rich snacks outside. But I want to really, really thank you because you've been fantastic. I could not imagine that we would cover so much tonight. And the same to you. Thank you so much for coming and for being so participatory. I guess what I've learned is that we really need to speak up, and that we need to, as in everything in life, know exactly where we stand in the face of it and be critical when silence is necessary and when instead it is sinful and dangerous is something that is up to us as individuals to be mindful of. So Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.